In July 1947, something came down outside Roswell, New Mexico. We know this. What we don't talk about, what gets buried beneath the debris field reports and the weather balloon retractions, is what happened in the hours after. One of the beings recovered from that site was alive, and according to 3 separate military witnesses whose testimonies didn't surface until decades later, it wasn't just alive. It was moving its hand, slowly, deliberately, like it was trying to write something in the air that no one in that room knew how to read, until 1997. That's when someone finally claimed they did. Let's start with the hand. I've spent the better part of 2 years pulling on this particular thread, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't expect it to lead anywhere significant. A twitching appendage on a dying extraterrestrial. That's the kind of detail that gets dismissed in the first paragraph of a debunking article. Involuntary motor response, post-trauma neurology, the body shutting down in stages. I've heard all the explanations, and on the surface every single one of them sounds reasonable. But then you look closer, and the official explanation starts to crack. The first account I found came from a deposition, not a published memoir, not a late-night radio interview, but an actual sworn deposition given by a man named Colonel Harlan Wick to a private research organisation in Albuquerque in September of 1989. Wick, by that point in his 80s and diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, described being present at what he called the secondary facility, a location separate from the primary crash site, where at least one of the recovered beings had been transported while still showing signs of biological activity. His words, transcribed by a researcher named Dr. Sylvia Crane, were clinical and measured in the way that only someone who has been holding something back for 40 years can manage. He said the being was small, grey-toned skin, large cranium, eyes that didn't move independently but tracked as a unit, and the hand, the right hand, he specified, which I think matters, was moving. Not spasmodically, not randomly, in slow, deliberate strokes through the air above the examination table. Wick said he watched it for 11 minutes before anyone in the room acknowledged what they were seeing. 11 minutes. Think about that. A room full of military personnel and scientists watching an extraterrestrial being move its hand through the air in what appeared to be intentional motion. And for 11 minutes nobody said a word. The silence, by any account, was total. Why 11 minutes? Why that specific number? It's the kind of detail that a fabricator usually gets wrong. They round up, they simplify. 11 is oddly precise. Wick even noted in his deposition that someone had been timing it, though he couldn't recall who had thought to start a stopwatch or why. That detail alone sent me digging deeper, and the deeper I went, the more the story refused to simplify. A second account emerged from a woman named Margaret Solares, a civilian typist who had been assigned to Roswell Army Airfield in the summer of 1947, and who, according to a recorded interview conducted in 1993 by independent researcher Tom Hadfield, had been in an adjacent room when the being was brought in. She didn't see the hand movement directly, but she heard the discussion afterward. Specifically, she recalled 2 officers arguing in the hallway, one insisting that what they'd observed was intentional communication, the other insisting it was biological noise. Biological noise. That phrase lodged itself in my mind and wouldn't leave. Because if it were simply involuntary movement, if it were just a dying nervous system firing randomly, why would any officer use the word communication at all? You don't argue about whether a reflex is communication. You only argue about that if some part of you genuinely believes it might be. Here's where it gets harder to dismiss. 3 weeks after Wick gave his deposition, a separate and entirely unconnected account surfaced. This one from a former Army Air Corps corpsman named Dennis Farlow, interviewed in Phoenix, Arizona by the same Dr. Sylvia Crane, who had transcribed Wick's testimony. Farlow and Wick had never met, according to Crane's notes. They had no documented connection. They were not part of the same social circles, had not attended the same reunions, and had not, as far as anyone could establish, been in contact since 1947. And yet Farlow described the same hand movement, not just movement, pattern. He described what he called a repeating sequence, something the hand returned to again and again, a series of strokes that he estimated at between 6 and 9 distinct gestures, cycling through in the same order each time. He said it reminded him of someone writing the same word repeatedly. His words, not my interpretation, his. That's the moment the official explanation collapses entirely, for me. Because now we're not talking about a twitch. We're not talking about post-crash neurological chaos. We're talking about a repeating sequence of 6 to 9 distinct gestures, cycling in consistent order, observed by at least 2 separate individuals who had no documented contact with one another, both of whom independently described it in similar terms without knowing the other had done the same. That's not noise, that's signal. But here's what troubled me even more. Nobody tried to record it, or if they did, those records don't exist. I filed 3 separate Freedom of Information requests between 2021 and 2023. What came back was heavily redacted, largely unhelpful, and contained the kind of uniform non-response that, once you've seen it applied consistently across multiple inquiries, starts to feel less like bureaucratic inefficiency and more like something deliberate. Not confirming, not denying, not explaining. Just silence. Again and again and again. The pattern repeats with a precision that, frankly, I find unsettling. What was in those rooms? What was captured, documented, or destroyed? And why does every trail that leads toward an answer terminate in the same kind of institutional blankness? Let me now tell you about Dr. Elliot Marsh. Marsh is not a household name. He wasn't a celebrity UFO researcher, didn't appear on television programs, didn't write best-selling books. He was a linguist, a structural linguist specifically, who spent most of his career at a small research institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico, working on what he described in his papers as non-phonemic symbolic communication systems. In plain language, he studied how intelligent beings might encode meaning through gesture, symbol, and spatial relationship rather than sound. He came to the Roswell material late. By his own account, he didn't seriously engage with the witness testimonies until the early 1990s, when a colleague passed him a copy of Hadfield's recorded interview with Margaret Solares. Marsh later wrote that he listened to the tape twice and then sat with it for 3 days before deciding it warranted further examination. 3 days. A structural linguist sits with a description of alien hand gestures for 3 days. That tells you something about what he heard in that tape. What Marsh did next is, to my mind, one of the most quietly remarkable episodes in the entire history of this subject. He didn't publicize his work, he didn't seek attention. Instead, over the next several years, he tracked down every witness account he could find. Not published UFO books, but raw testimony, sworn depositions, recorded interviews. He found 17 separate accounts describing the hand movement of the being at Roswell. 17, spread across different archives, different researchers, different decades. And when he mapped the gesture descriptions against one another, he found convergence. Not identical, not verbatim, but convergent. The same 6 to 9 movements described in different vocabularies by different people with different observational frameworks, resolving toward the same underlying structure when you stripped away the individual interpretive filters. Marsh called this gestural coherence across independent witnessing. In his private notes that only became available after his death in 2004, when his estate donated his papers to an independent archive in Taos, he wrote something I keep returning to. The movements are not random and not reflexive. They are recursive. Whatever this is, it was designed to be repeated. Designed to be repeated. Think about what that implies. If the being knew, or even suspected, that it was dying. If it understood in some fundamental sense that the beings around it were observing but not comprehending, if it possessed in those final hours enough cognitive function to make a calculated decision about how to spend its remaining capacity, why movement? Why not something more direct? Why not an attempt at vocalization, at pointing to objects, at drawing on available surfaces? And here's where it becomes impossible to ignore. Multiple witnesses reported that the being's eyes appeared to track the human observers during the hand movements, not randomly, specifically, as if monitoring whether the gesture was being received. That's not biological noise, that's an attempt at contact. Marsh published nothing publicly during his lifetime. His colleagues described him as intensely private, deeply skeptical of the UFO research community's sensationalist tendencies, and acutely aware of what academic association with this subject could do to a career. He had built his reputation carefully. He wasn't going to sacrifice it on a claim he couldn't fully support. But in 1997, 50 years after Roswell, he broke his silence in the most limited possible way. He gave a single talk. One talk at a small symposium held in Albuquerque in November of that year, attended by approximately 40 people, none of them media. The talk was recorded on a single consumer-grade cassette tape by an attendee named Phil Guerrero, who later described himself as a hobbyist researcher who had stumbled onto the event through a community bulletin board. The tape is, and I want to be precise here, partial. Guerrero recorded the last 32 minutes of what appears to have been an hour-long presentation. The first portion is gone. Nobody knows why Guerrero started recording late. He has said in subsequent interviews that he didn't think it would amount to anything at first. That's the strangest part. That's always the strangest part. The most significant moments in this story are perpetually, and with remarkable consistency, almost captured. What we have of the tape is this. Marsh, speaking in the measured cadence of a man who has been thinking about what he's going to say for a very long time, describes his process of mapping the witness gesture accounts against known non-phonemic communication systems. He references symbolic systems from 17 different pre-contact indigenous cultures, Mesopotamian numerical inscription methods, and what he calls topological language. Communication based not on discrete symbols but on spatial relationships between movements. He says, and I'm working from Guerrero's later transcription of the tape, that the being's gesture sequence resolves most cleanly against a topological framework, and that when interpreted through that lens, the repeating cycle appears to encode a small number of relational concepts, perhaps 3, perhaps 4, expressed in sequence. 3 or 4 concepts, repeated, cycling, designed to be received. What were they? Here's where I have to be careful, because Marsh himself was careful. He didn't claim to have decoded the message. He claimed to have identified a probable structural framework within which a decoding might be possible given sufficient additional data. But he did offer, at the end of the tape, and this is where Guerrero's account becomes genuinely difficult to sit with, what he described as the most defensible interpretation of the third element in the sequence. He said it appeared to indicate origin, not destination, not greeting, not distress, origin, as in where it came from. The tape cuts out 40 seconds after that statement. Guerrero, by his account, ran out of tape. The symposium ended. Marsh answered questions that were not recorded. Attendees left. Marsh drove back to Santa Fe. He never spoke publicly on the subject again. When I began trying to corroborate Marsh's claims through independent channels, I ran into something I've come to think of as the characteristic texture of this entire subject. The presence of what should be there and the consistent peculiar absence of what actually is. Let me be specific. The Albuquerque Symposium of November 1997, where Marsh gave his talk, was organised by a man named Gerald Hoyt, a retired aerospace contractor who had been running small research gatherings since the late 1980s. Hoyt kept meticulous records, attendance logs, speaker agreements, correspondence. His widow, Patricia Hoyt, who still lives outside Santa Fe, showed me several boxes of his files when I visited her in the spring of 2022. Gerald had been thorough. His records from every symposium between 1988 and 2003 were present and largely intact, except November 1997. Not missing, not damaged, not misfiled, absent, a complete gap. Patricia said she had noticed it herself and assumed Gerald had simply kept those files separately, somewhere she hadn't found, but she'd been through everything. Twice. I don't want to overstate this. Files go missing. People misfiled things. An absence isn't evidence of removal, but the pattern repeats. Tom Hadfield, the researcher who recorded the original Margaret Solaris interview in 1993, told me in a phone conversation that his original recording was stolen from his car outside a diner in Flagstaff in 1995. He had copies, but the master tape, which contained portions of the interview he had never transcribed, was gone. He reported it to local police. The report exists, the tape doesn't. Dr. Sylvia Crane's transcription notes from her 1989 sessions with Harlan Wick, the original typed transcripts, were destroyed in a house fire in 1998. Crane herself survived. The originals didn't. She had, fortunately, mailed copies to a colleague, which is how we have any record at all. But the originals, with her handwritten margin notes and any material she had chosen not to type up formally, gone. I am not claiming coordination. I'm not pointing at a specific hand pulling these threads. I'm simply noting that the documentary record around this subject has a habit of thinning precisely where it should be thickest, and that this thinning follows a pattern too consistent to attribute entirely to chance. Once you see it, you genuinely cannot unsee it. Let's sit with Marsh's interpretation for a moment. If the third element in the gesture sequence indicated origin, if the being was, in some structured and deliberate way, attempting to communicate where it had come from, what does that tell us about its mental state in those final hours? It tells us it was thinking clearly enough to prioritize, not distress, not pain, not a request for assistance, which would have been the most immediately practical communication for a being in its situation. Origin. It chose, apparently, to tell us where it was from. Why? Is that a greeting protocol, something so deeply embedded in its communicative instinct that it surfaces even in crisis? Is it an attempt to establish context, to provide a framework within which further communication might be possible? Or is it something else entirely, a kind of final identification, the equivalent of a name on a headstone? I keep asking myself, what do you say when you know you're not going to be understood and you know you're dying and you do it anyway? You say the thing that matters most. You say the thing you most need the other person to know. And this raises a question that I find genuinely difficult to move past. If the origin was communicated, if Marsh's interpretation holds even partially, then someone, somewhere with access to better resources than one aging linguist in Santa Fe may have made progress on this that we don't know about. The evidence suggests something much larger was happening around this material than a few independent researchers piecing together witness testimony. The level of institutional response, the FOI redactions, the consistent documentary gaps, the uniform non-disclosure, implies organizational engagement with this material at a scale that dwarfs anything in the public record. Which means the question isn't just what did the being say? The question is who else has already figured it out, and what did they do with the answer? Marsh died in 2004, 7 years after his single public statement. He left no published papers on the Roswell material, no formal academic record of his analysis, nothing that could be cited, peer-reviewed, built upon. What exists is a partial cassette tape, a posthumous archive that has been only partially catalogued, and the memories of roughly 40 people who were in a room in Albuquerque one November evening and heard a careful man tell them something extraordinary. Most of those 40 people haven't spoken about it. I found 6 who would. Of those 6, 4 declined to go on record. One said he didn't think he'd understood what Marsh was saying at the time and couldn't trust his memory of it now. The 6th, a woman who asked me not to use her name, who had been a graduate student in linguistics at the University of New Mexico in 1997 and attended the symposium out of what she described as academic curiosity, told me something that I haven't been able to let go of. She said that after Marsh finished speaking, there was a silence in the room. A real silence. Not polite, not awkward. The kind of silence that falls when a room full of people is trying to understand whether what they just heard is true. And then someone in the back, she didn't know who, asked Marsh why he'd waited 50 years. She said Marsh looked at the question for a moment before answering. And then he said, "I waited until I was sure I wasn't wrong about the structure. I'm still not sure about the content. I may never be. But the structure holds. The structure holds. A dying alien, a repeating gesture, a linguist who spent the better part of a decade in private before saying a single word publicly in a room of 40 people into a tape recorder that ran out of tape. What do we lose when knowledge doesn't survive its keepers? What do we lose when the only person who had assembled the full picture is gone, and the picture is distributed across boxes in a partially catalogued archive, a partial cassette, and the fading memories of people who won't go on record? And here's the question that keeps me up at night. What if it wasn't just origin? What if the sequence contained more, a second concept, a first concept, elements that Marsh identified but hadn't yet interpreted to his own satisfaction, details that died with him in Santa Fe in the summer of 2004? What if the being communicated something complete, a full message, and the only person who ever got close to reading it is gone? I don't know what the hand was writing. I don't know if Marsh was right about the framework or right about the origin element, or whether the 6 to 9 gestures mean anything at all beyond what a dying nervous system produces in its final hours. I hold all of that uncertainty genuinely, but I know that 17 separate witnesses across decades of independent testimony describe the same movement with enough structural similarity that a careful and skeptical linguist found it worth 9 years of private analysis. I know that the documentary record around this subject thins precisely where it should be richest, and that this thinning follows a consistency that casual coincidence cannot fully explain. I know that a man who spent his career studying how intelligence encodes meaning sat with this material for 3 days before deciding it warranted further examination, and then spent 9 more years examining it. And I know that in a room in Albuquerque in November 1997, he said the structure holds. So I'm left with the questions. What was the origin? What solar system? What coordinate system? What framework of spatial reference would have been used to point to home from a table in New Mexico? What were the other elements in the sequence? The ones Marsh hadn't yet interpreted, the ones that may still be sitting in a partially catalogued archive waiting for someone with the right combination of skills and access to find them. Did it know we couldn't read it? Did it do it anyway? And if so, why? What do you say into a silence you know will last 50 years? What do you write in the air when no one in the room knows how to read? And perhaps most quietly, most persistently, if the message was about origin, if that being spent its final hours trying to tell us where it came from, what was it hoping we would do with that information? What were we supposed to do next?